Hello, and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Lauren Bravo. I'm a lifestyle journalist and the author of How to Break Up with Fast Fashion, a book that aims to help people slow down their shopping habits and forge a more sustainable relationship with their wardrobes, which includes one of my lifelong passions, charity shops. Today's event forms part of the Being Human Festival, the UK's only festival of the humanities. Being Human celebrates innovative research in literature, languages, music and more, with around 300 events taking place across the country each November. This year, all events are, of course, online, and you can view the programme, which runs until the 22nd of November, on the Being Human Festival website. Now, I'm delighted to be joined this evening by two social historians, Dr Georgina Brewis and Dr George Gosling. Georgina is Associate Professor at UCL and leads an Academy-funded project aiming to illustrate the importance of voluntary sector records and archives as part of our national history. I'm also joined by George Gosling, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton and researches the history of charity shopping. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Georgina and George to our virtual stage for a whistle-stop tour through the history of charity shops and a discussion about their fascinating research. Our tour will last around 30 minutes, and towards the end of the event, we will take a selection of audience questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please submit this in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You are, of course, also welcome to tweet during the event, and you can tag us at British Academy _. So welcome, Georgina and George.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you very much.
Good evening. So to start us off, of course, there is nothing that charity shop fans love more than showing off our favourite discoveries. So we thought we would begin by having a bit of a show and tell. I know that you've brought along a couple of things to show us. Georgina, what is your best ever charity shop find and why is it so special?
I think the best ever find would have to be this entire 1960s, late 60s, early 70s dinner service because it's beautiful. It's absolutely mint condition. I managed to get 6 dinner plates, 6 middle-sized plates, 6 side plates, 6 bowls, 6 cups and saucers, and some larger platters for £10.
Wow, that is a bargain.
Get out for sorry, children. For £10 in a charity shop in Ilford. I have got a few other items that are not technically charity shop purchases, but they're about the history of charity shops. So this is my kind of other fun item, which is Sooty. Sooty with a collecting jar. You can see the thing on the top for the Royal National Institute for the Blind.
Lovely. And George, anything that you'd like to show us, or maybe something you're wearing?
Well, I think like many people who like charity shops, I'm often kitted out in charity shop gear, particularly T-shirts and shirts. So I will show you my T-shirt. That I'm very fond of this one, but I have lots and lots of T-shirts. So this T-shirt is from the St Mary's Hospice shop in Birmingham, where my wife actually works, and this shirt is from the St Christopher's Hospice shop in Bristol, where I'm from. But I'm kitted out in charity shop gear. My house is kitted out, especially having lots of short-term jobs as a young academic. I've moved around a lot and had to go to British Heart Foundation shops time and again for sofas and wardrobes and all sorts of things. So I have things all around the house, including even the coffee cup I'm drinking out of right at this moment. Charity shop purchases everywhere you look.
Well, I can certainly identify. I am wearing head-to-toe charity shop tonight, and I've also brought along for my little show and tell probably my favourite ever charity shop find. These are my 1970s 1990s does the 70s platform clogs by Buffalo. And my first book was about the Spice Girls, and I've wanted a pair of Buffalo platforms, I think, since I was about 8 years old. And I was actually behind the counter at the charity shop that I volunteer in when a customer brought those shoes to the counter and asked if we could put them by for her friend who might like to come back and look at them. And we put them by till the end of the day, which is our policy. And at 7 o'clock, the doors were locked and the friend had never shown up. So I took that as a sign from the universe that they were meant to be mine. And we've been very happy together ever since. Now, I know that we've had people sharing their own top finds on social media as well. We would love you to carry on doing that, please, and use the hashtag shopping for a cause. One of my Twitter followers was very proud of having bought a Gucci bag for 50p, which is, I think, the kind of mythological holy grail of charity shopping that keeps the rest of us hoping and hunting. Georgina, have you had any favourite stories shared with you so far?
Yeah, I mean, I like the story that was posted on. We wrote a blog for the Social History Society, and somebody posted a comment about how in the 1970s, this person made friends with the local charity shop old ladies, as he called them, and they would set aside items for him, including a 1930s suit that he was very much after, and he really liked that. So that was his kind of. He was going obviously back from the 70s to the 30s for his vintage finds.
Wow, that just shows you've got decades and decades worth of eras and references to find. So without further ado, should we begin our tour? Right, so I think we're starting outside the shop with the shop front. Now, if we're imagining we're standing on a virtual high street, I'm sure it's quite a familiar scene to all of us. Charity shops are a quintessential part of the British high street these days, and obviously they hold a special place in the hearts of many people. But has this always been the case?
Yeah, so you can see in this image, this could be basically any high street in Britain. Charity shops are completely, very familiar to all of us. There are over 11,000 of them across the UK. Most of us will have either shopped in one or donated to them at some point, and they do enjoy a lot of support from the public. So research from the Charities Aid Foundation finds that in the past 12 months, 38% of UK adults have bought some goods and as a way of giving to charity. That's kind of how people describe it. And 56% of people have donated goods, again, as a way of giving to charity. We know that it's more likely that women and older people are those both donating goods and also buying goods in charity shops. In a normal year, and of course this is not a normal year, charity shops, according to the Charity Retail Association, raise around £300 million. Now that's really essential income to a lot of charities, and it is really sad that that's really been threatened this year with so many shops being closed for extended periods in the first lockdown. And again, they're struggling with a second lockdown at the moment, as well as kind of ongoing issues around volunteers and kind of issues to do with how they can actually process the donations that people still want to make. I think it's worth noting that as long as there have been charity shops like this on British High Street, there's also been controversy about charity shops on British High Street. So there have been press features asking if there are too many charity shops on high streets, but that's nothing new. That's kind of, you can see those stories going right back to the 1960s, even though in the 1960s, there was actually quite a lot of support from local communities and local traders for new charity shops being established. And it's this period that there's been this big increase in their number. George has found that in his research. It makes some sense that the 1960s really would be this time of expansion. There are a couple of kind of interesting factors here. So the 60s really saw the rise of the throwaway consumer culture, in which people are being encouraged to buy new things rather than kind of mend and repair old ones. So buy new, but then donate what you no longer need to charity shops. This was also set aside kind of some really serious social problems that are being revealed in Britain in the 1960s, particularly around poverty, but also very poor housing conditions. And that's really epitomised in the film Cathy Come Home, the drama about homelessness. So it does mean that there's a number of people that need to shop in charity shops to buy these cheap secondhand goods. But at the same time, these kind of broader global issues, such as the Biafran War and the appalling famine and humanitarian crisis that accompanied that, really become a focal point for the important work that a number of British international charities, including Oxfam, are doing at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the shops themselves, things are changing for charity shops at that time, partly because of this shop we're looking at here. By the late 1960s, the success of Oxfam's sort of flagship store, this one on Broad Street in Oxford, it was something that local branches of lots of different charities were looking to and sort of setting out to copy that success. These ones that were copying it often were, less commercially minded and a bit more rough and ready, perhaps, than this shop. And that could even be true, actually, of Oxfam shops, local branches of Oxfam all around the country, sort of setting out to copy the Oxford Broad Street shop, but not necessarily quite doing it in the same way. But even still, it was this shop that often they were looking to as a kind of source of inspiration. And for that reason, you can be forgiven for thinking that maybe that was the first ever charity shop. They even have this plaque outside commemorating the fact that they opened in the run-up to Christmas in 1947. But there was also a time not long before that when there were sort of similar shops that were a presence all across the country. During the Second World War, the British Red Cross had a sort of network of secondhand fundraising shops nationally. And there was even one on Broad Street, just 120 yards away from where the Oxfam shop would open, shortly after. But the Red Cross shop was, much bigger and only closed at the end of the war because the premises were taken back by the owner and they needed to find somewhere new. So that's probably, going back to the Second World War, that's probably as far back as we can go with charity shops quite as we know them today, that familiar sort of charity shop, with volunteers selling secondhand goods in a fixed shop space as a fundraising effort. But that wasn't the start of charities running shops. Going back further, there's actually a longer and a much more varied history as well.
Right, so I'm getting the sense that the charity shop as we know it today probably doesn't represent the whole history. So can you tell us a bit more about these earlier charity enterprises?
Well, there was quite a range of different sorts of charity-run shops. In fact, the earliest reference that I've been able to find to a charity shop using that phrase was actually something very different. In 1766, a granary was set up in Bamborough Castle as a charitable initiative to provide subsidised grain to the poor of Northumberland. 30 years later, they opened a shop that was occasionally called a charity shop, but more often a cheap shop or a meal shop, which sold a range of everyday necessities, from beans to butter and candles to pins. But if we go on 100 years, then we find that the Salvation Army was selling secondhand goods to those who might have struggled to afford them normally. But this was not just about selling cheap to people who needed it. It was also a sort of, initially at least, a sort of job creation scheme, really. So collecting and then selling salvage was one part of the operation of what the Salvation Army called their elevators. These developed from being shelters into being places for men to train in new skills, and selling secondhand goods was one of those skills. But interestingly, the Salvation Army was actually doing a sort of different set of things. They were also doing something very different from their trade department. And you can see here the headquarters of the trade department on the corner of Judd Street, just by Euston Station. What they were doing there was sort of selling a whole host of purpose-made goods, always made by Salvationists, that could kind of kit you out with everything you needed to live a good Salvationist life. This might include the uniform that you might wear, or the musical instruments you might need to play in the Salvation Army band. And it was a very profitable side of their operation, and because of that, they received quite a lot of criticism for it. But they weren't the only people selling purpose-made goods. Without the focus on making a profit, you also see disability charities at the turn of the century opening shops. These would have been linked to the craft workshops of the kind that we see here. And the shops would have been sort of trying to find a market for the items that were being produced. And there's often quite a negative view now of these charities, and the fact that these charities were training people up in lines of work that would soon look rather dated. But the shops were an important part of keeping those schemes functioning, sometimes as late as the 1980s. So the whole range of things going on there.
That's really interesting. So if we are looking into the window of our charity shop, today we would be used to seeing dressed up mannequins, maybe a selection of homewares, even larger pieces of furniture, perhaps some seasonal displays. But what would people have seen in charity shop windows of the past? Would it have been very different?
So the store windows are really operating to kind of entice customers in. Yeah, I'm hoping you can see this picture of the Oxfam shop on Broad Street again. They're actually often quite cluttered and quite crowded, so you have to get up quite close to actually see the things that are inside, but you can kind of look through beyond there to see what's being sold. Of course, this reflects kind of wider trends in retail at the time. You know, often these shops that are selling a wide range of goods have kind of got them on display. They're not quite as minimalist, I think, as our charity shops today, where they can maybe take one nice handbag and one nice dress and display it, again, reflecting more contemporary ways of displaying things. We need to remember, though, that in addition to fundraising and kind of raising money through the things they sold, the charity shop has always offered a kind of opportunity for publicity and awareness raising very much by being at the heart of the community. So before 1989, charities are not able to buy commercial advertising on television in the UK, and radio appeals, any kind of charity appeal, is very highly regulated. So having these kind of shop windows, effectively they are shop windows, literally shop windows, advertising a charity's cause, its campaign, to the local public when people are at this point, certainly before the 1980s, you know, really doing all their shopping by going into local high streets. It's a really important place for them to have that opportunity. So, for example, the Red Cross Week every March, every springtime, it kind of varies, May, March, are kind of advertised in the store windows of the British Red Cross. And there are other similar examples. So, for example, during times where there's a big kind of huge fundraising campaign. So, for example, in 1984-85, there's a massive campaigning and fundraising for the famine in Ethiopia, and charity shops are using their shop window to put these big posters up to try and solicit donations to that. Inside the shop as well, there are kind of other ways that they're using posters and displays to encourage people to volunteer, to get involved in campaigns, to sign petitions, to perhaps donate goods or bring in things like old coins or foreign coins to raise money. So they're really using the space, charities using the space very cleverly, in a really wide range of ways. So basically, as long as there've been these kind of charity shops, there's been this mix of showing off kind of what's on sale, but also what is the cause and what's the cause behind it. So a really kind of classic example of that is St Dunstan's, which is this charity set up to rehabilitate and retrain people wounded, well, soldiers and sailors wounded during the First World War, and it kind of continues. But they very much use their shop windows to advertise the wares that they're selling. These, of course, are all made by the blinded ex-service people. But they also kind of, here you can see in this picture, this kind of claim of victory over blindness. They have a very explicit charitable sales pitch within the way it's framed.
Yeah, it's a really striking store, isn't it? Now, I'm already imagining what treasures might have awaited shoppers inside. So should we go into our virtual shop? Now, in a charity shop on today's high street, of course, the first thing we would probably see when we walk through the door is racks of second-hand clothing, maybe also some toys, some bric-a-brac. Has this always been the case, or did they used to be full of very different offerings?
Well, it hasn't necessarily been the case at all, in fact. In the research I've been doing, the oldest fundraising shop that I've been able to find actually didn't sell secondhand goods at all. Despite the tradition of charity bazaars, the earliest dedicated fundraising shop that I've been able to find in this country was a flower shop in the West End of London, from 1870 until the late 1930s. The money raised was entirely given over to a charity called St Agatha's Mission, a religious charity working in the West End. But then you can see something very different here in this image, which is from the Salvation Army's Trade Department headquarters, which was really more like an upmarket department store. So again, very different from what we might think of, but you still have the clothes and things that you can rummage around. You can see this is an advertisement for their seasonal sale in 1893 at Christmas for their Salvation Emporium, as they're calling it. So this is something different. Like an apartment store, that's very different from what you get shortly afterwards when they start opening salvage stores. And that's something perhaps more familiar to us, a bit more like a very early version of the charity shops that we know. So this image here is from 1809. This is the Leeds salvage store. This is where their Leeds elevator had opened a shop in order to sell the salvage items that have been collected. And the Salvation Army's magazine, War Cry, by this point, they are publishing an article with this picture and describing the bargain sales that you could find here on hats and clothes, on fabrics, umbrellas and footwear, all which they said was more or less in a repairable condition. But there were all kinds of really unusual items. You might be able to see them in the kind of back of this picture too. There were, they said, bathtubs, sewing machines, meat choppers, mangles, prams and cradles, chairs, magazines and books, the occasional firearm, and as they said in War Cry, enough china and glassware to stock a small shop.
And you can see from this, the next image, which is again Oxfam Broad Street shop, but it's a bit later from the 1960s, that this idea of china and glassware is really a recurrent theme. So cutlery, decorative items, there's also kind of silverware and brassware and things like that. They become really a mainstay of the shops. And of course, they are still important today. If you go into any charity shop today, you'll find kind of similar items.
Or indeed into my flat, which is full of charity shop ceramics and glassware. I can't resist it. I love the idea of the charity department store as well. I wish we still had those around today. So if we move further inside the shop, these days we might also see displays of new purpose-made products. So things like fair trade tea and chocolate, maybe jewellery, crafts, items handmade by people who are supported by the charity. Do these types of goods have a long history in charity shops as well, or are they quite a modern introduction?
Yeah, so definitely they do have this kind of much longer history. So here we can think about the Salvation Army particularly, which developed a really wide range of what we might again today see as ethical products. So these included things like non-phosphorus matches, they wanted to kind of shine a light in darkest England. And the difference with those matches was that they didn't contain phosphorus. So the so-called match girls who were suffering extensively and kind of going on strike over this, getting sick from phossy-jaw, which was this kind of phosphorus causing the jawbone itself to rot. So a really, really horrible disease and a kind of occupational hazard. So the Salvation Army designed these non-phosphorus ones to sell as an alternative. Similarly, they pioneered a caffeine-free coffee substitute, which they called Kaffy with a K, Kaffy. And you can see in the Bristol trade headquarters that these are the kind of products that are being sold there. And this is quite a nice example of how in the past they kind of balanced ethical consumerism with something that is much more commercially minded and is definitely about making money. The fact that you were invited to have a tour of these kind of trade headquarters, you could try out the musical instruments, you could taste the coffee and other kind of ethically produced tea, is something that the Salvation Army was really keen to promote, to advertise. They wanted people to come into their trade departments and try these things out. And that's a really nice example of what I guess we might call this kind of experience economy today.
Yeah, and another place where you could do a tour behind the scenes of the shops that were selling these new goods was also these disability charities. So they're another place. They're selling new goods, of course, the goods made in the workshops. And perhaps the earliest shop of this kind was this one you can see here, local to my university. In 1899, the Wolverhampton Society for the Blind opened its first shop. This was 24 years after the society started its work, which was initially to do with home visiting and teaching people to read Braille. And the shop was opened 17 years after they opened their first workshop. And in these workshops, you would have had blind men and women who learned to and worked making baskets, chairs and mats. And then these were the items that were on sale in the shop. And the sale of them brought in over £1,000 a year, which was not enough to mean the shop was really running at a profit. But it was breaking even, and it was facilitating some kind of earning some kind of living to be earned, I should say. And that enough was seen as the operation being successful enough for them to open a second shop. And in 1928, they opened another one in Dudley. So it obviously had some legs, this scheme.
So that idea of giving people skills as well as support is, I suppose, it's another layer of positive impact on the part of charity shops. Are there other examples of that kind of upskilling that have happened in the charity shop world?
Yeah, so a kind of more ambitious version of that, really developing this, was adopted by the charity St Dunstan's. This is a charity that today, it still exists today. It's called Blind Veterans UK today. Here's another image of the Regent Street shop. So this was a shop opened in 1922 on London's Regent Street, right in the heart of London. It was actually opened by Mr Selfridge of Selfridge's store, just around the corner. And he came around to open this in this kind of grand ceremony. And you can see again inside some of the in the window, some of the items that are being sold. These are all items that are made by blinded ex-servicemen who are trained up to become craftsmen and really skilled at making these things. Some of the most popular things that they made were trays. So baskets and wooden tea trays. You can see inside here a kind of browsing through some of these items. Now the trays are quite an interesting one because they were so kind of solidly made, so widely made that they're still really available, and there's a kind of thriving second-hand market for them on eBay. And I do happen to have one here myself. So I actually own two of these. Sorry, you've just moved the camera. Yeah. So it's a beautiful wooden tray, sort of 1920s. I actually have two of them because I just really kind of like them. And the fact that it's quite discreet, the fact that they're kind of a charitable product, that's quite interesting. All you have to do is look for the St Dunstan's insignia, which is often kind of hidden away. I've got one tray, it's on the handle, on the other tray, it's kind of around the back. So it's a way of kind of showing your support. And I think when you're bringing out your tea and coffee, serving your friends, they kind of know that you've bought this, but it's not ostentatious. You're not kind of showing it too much. I actually came across one of them in an Airbnb when I was staying once, and I realized that this is a really, really old house, and this tray had been being used since the 1920s in this house. It was quite interesting. So like the Salvation Army, the potential customers are kind of welcome to tour the workshops in which these trays and the baskets and other things are being made. And then they're kind of sold at the Regent Street shop. But this is part of something that's much bigger, as George has been looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing some research in the archive of Blind Veterans UK, and something that had been sort of largely forgotten until I was doing this research was just the scale of the St Dunstan's retail operation in communities across the country. So it wasn't just a case of, say, the charity opening like a chain of shops all over the place, but instead what they were doing was sort of setting up their St Dunstaners, as they called the people who, had been, the people who'd used their services for rehab and training. The St Dunstaners were being set up with their own shops, being set up as shopkeepers in local communities all across the country. So the idea was that setting them up as cobblers or picture framers, as shopkeepers selling the baskets and mats that they made, this would provide them both with a sort of local customer base, but also would then kind of embed them within a community where local people could help them adjust to their new lives. And there were quite a lot of these shops. At their peak after the Second World War, there was more than 100 shops at one time, around the country, run by these men and their wives. It was always assumed to be a kind of husband and wife local kind of business team. But at these local shops, where the typical sign over the door would say "Trained by St Dunstan's." In many cases, what you had was that St Dunstan's didn't just train them up and then sort of send them off. They actually would often buy the shops, and then they had a scheme where the shopkeeper could buy the shop out of the profits if the shop proved successful. And the types of shops that they were running actually changed hugely over the years, over the course of the 20th century. So by the 1950s and 60s, they were much more likely to be newsagents, confectioners, tobacconists even. This is not what we typically imagine when we think of a charity shop, is it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, as I mentioned before, I'm sometimes the person who might be asking people if they need any help in a charity shop. So I've volunteered in my favourite charity shop for 2.5 years now. And honestly, I find it so rewarding that often it's like they're doing me a favour, because it's just really brilliant to escape my laptop screen for a few hours, meet some new people, do something that feels practical and useful and has clear, tangible benefits for a good cause. Of course, getting to peruse the racks in the back room before everybody else is a perk as well. But obviously today, many charities depend on volunteers like me to staff their shops. But as you've just told us, since the St Dunstan's craftsmen ran their own. So can you tell us a little bit more about who was running the charity shops of the past?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, these like disabled craftsmen and shopkeepers were not the only sort of paid staff running shops for charities. From the 1880s, the Salvation Army's trade department was running a highly professional operation, exclusively hiring Salvationists, as one example. But then in the last, say, half century or so, there's often been a mix of paid staff and volunteers. So you might have sort of members of a charity, perhaps volunteering to help run a shop to raise funds for the local branch. While in other cases, you might have a charity hiring someone to head up their kind of retail operation or to run a particular shop. One example of this I came across, I spent a lot of time reading old newspapers, sort of local newspapers from all over the country, to kind of piece together where were all these different charity shops and what was going on with them. And some people were particularly good at getting into the local papers. And one of them was a woman I kept coming across called Mary Clow. So in 1969, this retired chemist, Mary, answered an advert to work for a small charity, a Cambridge-based charity set up by a reverend in Cambridge called the Society for Aid to the Hungry and Needy. And she opened a shop for them in Rugby. And I mean, it seemed like she was getting more interest from the local paper than from customers to start with, at least. Although business apparently did pick up by 50% after she decided to leave little Marcus at home. Little Marcus was her Jack Russell, who seemed to have a particular fondness for attacking the ankles of any men who came into the shop and sort of fending them off.
It's not great for business.
No, thanks, George. So that's a great example of what kind of charity leaders in the 1960s and 70s might not want to have happened in their shops. You definitely don't want dogs biting your customers. This is, of course, a time of like wider professionalisation within the voluntary sector. And some charities got a bit concerned that some of their local groups and individuals were kind of setting up their own fundraising shops. It was, to some extent, a bit of a struggle sometimes to exert control over what was happening in the charity's name on high streets across the country. So there has been a kind of shift and a change. And so local volunteers generally lost a lot of that kind of autonomy that they had to kind of set up their own shops and run them. And paid shop managers really became the norm later on. But charity shops today still, of course, are absolutely central kind of sites of volunteering. The Charity Retail Association reports that there are more than 230,000 retail volunteers nationwide. Some of them are still run by volunteers, and they remain these really important sites of intergenerational kind of mixing, cross-class encounters that happen every day.
Yeah, it's a lot of volunteers, isn't it? Well, that's definitely my experience as well. I think the volunteers seem to get as much out of it often as the charities and the shoppers do. So, right, we're on the home straight of our tour now, but we haven't talked about us yet, the shoppers. So from my own perspective, rummaging through the rails is great fun, but it's also a very good way to be more sustainable. I suppose charity shoppers of the past probably had slightly different reasons for visiting, I'm imagining. So who might we have seen shopping there and why?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's always been a mix of people. So it's always been this kind of way of showing support for a particular cause or a campaign. And it's also this very practical way of buying affordable goods. So charities have always tried to appeal to those two different types of customer. But charity consumers have not always just kind of needed affordable and cheap necessities, but they might have kind of wanted to buy into a particular lifestyle. So, a really good example here is the Salvation Army, whereas kitting yourself out as a Salvationist, completely kind of buying into the entire lifestyle, you would need to be going to the Salvation stores in order to be able to do that. Likewise, wanting to support blinded veterans. Now, this could be on a kind of national scale, or it could be simply that you are friends with the the blinded ex-serviceman that's running the local shop, and so you kind of develop that loyalty and you want to keep going back and supporting him and his wife, for example. You can kind of see how that would work out. People, of course, wanting to shop kind of vintage, seeking out these kind of vintage chic wardrobes. Of course, that's nothing new. So in the 1970s, people might be looking back to the 20s and 30s to find their vintage wardrobe. Today, we might be looking to the 60s and 70s for our vintage wardrobes. And of course, as many of us have turned against what Lauren, you described as this fast fashion, throwaway fashion, it's become a really ethical choice for people to avoid buying new goods by going to charity shops.
Yeah, and there's another type of customer who we don't usually think of when we're thinking about charity shops, but there are people we can find who are actually shop customers buying from charities in the NHS hospital. So from the 1950s, you've got leagues of friends who are running shops and canteens. You know, they are charities raising money to support the hospital in various ways. And they are running shops providing everyday items and some luxuries for hospital visitors. While you've also then got the Red Cross, both running shops, but also taking their trolley shop around the wards. And from the 1970s, the Red Cross, the British Red Cross, has a big focus on opening new hospital shops and canteens. Sometimes instead of its high street shops, sometimes there's a bit of a shift in their focus. And I think these are really important as, you know, non-medical spaces on the hospital site. They were somewhere for various community and self-help groups to meet. And that's an important part of what they were doing as well. And I think we've got a photo an image to show that from the Hillingdon League of Friends there.
Wow, that's a great image. Some brilliant fashion in that picture as well, 1973. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us probably will have encountered League of Friends in hospitals without really relating them to charity shops, but that's such a good point. Well, that brings us to the end of our tour. Thank you both so much. So we've peered in through the window to look at who's working there, what's for sale, who's buying it. But we're going to finish with a big question. Why does any of this matter? What can we gain from understanding how charity shops have evolved over time?
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of different things that we can take from this. They're an interesting kind of, you know, multifaceted part of our social history. But I think for the way we view charity shops today, I think it matters. I think understanding the history of charity-run shops, which have not always been charity shops as we know them, I think this gives us a different perspective on today's charity shops. One thing we might say is, you know, the sort of the separation we commonly see of charity shops as funding operations, sort of separated in many respects from the social and community activities of their parent charity and from its kind of core charitable projects. I think this marks out today's charity shops as historically anomalous. And of course, that separation is not always so clear-cut, as can be seen when we find charity shops selling the products of social businesses and projects that are supported by the charity. But you do find, you know, we often see, don't we, sort of news stories that are denouncing all of these sorts of practices as some kind of deviation from the supposedly kind of proper role of a charity shop. And the same is often, you know, the case when it comes to paying staff. Yet both practices have long histories. So, you know, I think charity shops have long served as hubs for community action, as a meeting point for the charity and the public, and as sites of volunteering that engender cross-class and cross-generational encounters of all kinds. And I think the history helps us to remember that is a big part of what they are and what they always have been.
Absolutely. And Georgina, I know that the key theme of your project is to campaign and raise awareness to protect the records of charities and other voluntary organisations. Why is that so important?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, I think, really important. We wouldn't know any of this, and wouldn't know any of this kind of fascinating history that George has been researching if it wasn't for the fact that charities have retained, preserved, looked after their records. So both the kind of paper-based records, but also the objects. And that, you know, if we're thinking about materiality, the kind of material culture of charity and charity shops is so much about things. That's why it's really exciting that in the archives, for example, of Blind Veterans UK, you can see the trays, you can see the baskets, you can see the typewriters that people are being used. So they've kind of really kept and retained these. The records of voluntary organisations are really, really essential assets. They're absolutely essential for us as researchers, but also for a wider public to be able to understand the significance of voluntary organisations and of charity to British society, past and present, because they have had an enormous impact. And I think we need to understand that better. Charities, of course, often preserve the histories of individuals and communities that have been in some way marginalised, maybe particularly vulnerable, and whose voices can sometimes go unheard. For voluntary organisations themselves, opening their archives is really important because it helps them build trust. It helps them kind of improve accountability to people that they work with, to beneficiaries, to users, to donors, and to other communities. However, the problem is that the archives and records of charities are quite vulnerable, so they're not protected in the same way that government records are, nor are they protected by, and there are lots of other kind of private archives that are better protected because they're better resourced and they have better support systems. So our project that the British Academy has been supporting now for 6 years and is kind of going on an ongoing basis is really important at trying to kind of raise awareness of this issue, to work with archivists, historians, owners of records, voluntary sector leaders, to basically kind of raise awareness of this. And we would just like to end by thanking the fantastic archivists that George and I have worked with as part of this project, and we do on an ongoing basis. So thank you very much, charity archivists, because you're absolutely great, and we need you.
Absolutely. Thank you all to the archivists. And thank you very much to Georgina and George for that fascinating tour through the history of charity shops. So we are now going to open up to some audience questions. And I've got some really interesting ones that have come through. I think we can fit in as many as we can. So, right, here's a good one. Do other countries have the same charity shop culture as the UK? So we know that the US has thrift shops. I know I'm often hearing on, American TV shows, they'll talk about going to Goodwill. But what about Europe? What about other parts of the world?
Well, it is quite unusual. It is quite distinctive, and it's different from that American tradition in some respects. The thrift store and Goodwill fits with the sort of things you might find the kind of Salvation Army secondhand shop tradition, but we have. The scale and variety of what we've been talking about is quite different. What you have in other countries does vary. So just to pick one example, in Germany, you do there is a tradition of third world shops, as they are known, but that is specifically that they would tend to be selling craft items made in third world countries, as they might be called. We might use other phrases as well. But it's countries where there are projects that are being supported by the charity. So we do see this in these sort of trading I'm trying to remember exactly what there is, like trading departments, I think typically we would call them, whether that's Oxfam or Christian Aid or whatever it might be. That is those craft projects in those particular places that are being supported, and that tends to be the whole focus of what you get in the German shops. So that's quite different. Again, it's one part of it, not the whole range of what we've been talking about today.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. Do we think that other countries might sort of catch on and start introducing more charity shops in our model, or is it just quite a uniquely British phenomenon?
Well, I suppose that's your journalism, might spread the word, who knows?
I'll certainly do my bit to evangelise for them overseas. So another very interesting question, I know something that I end up talking to a lot of people about quite regularly. What about, so it's kind of two questions here, but I think they'll both feed into one another. With antique shows highlighting charity shop purchases that sell for a considerable sum, are charity shops becoming more aware and savvy to see if they can value items that could bring them in more income? And then leading on from that, what about the modern trend we have then of people buying from charity shops to resell at a profit online? Is that against the whole spirit of the thing, or does it not matter as long as the charities are getting that income?
Well,
Georgina?
do you want to start, George?
Yeah, I mean, so I can't really speak for the kind of contemporary charity shops and their business practices. I think what we've seen is that in the past, charities have had a very kind of business-like approach to this, and they've understood that that they need to pitch things at the right price to get people in the door, but in order to make to turn a profit. So in that sense, and obviously you've got groups like the Charity Retail Association that provide training and kind of support and kind of guidance on this. We know that there's a differentiation of types of charity shops. So you'll find these kind of more high-end boutique type charity shops, often in kind of posher parts of town. There's a very nice one down in Blackheath in South London, for example, whereas you go to a different part of town and you might get products that are sold at a different price. In terms of people kind of making money by finding items in charity shops and then selling them off for a profit, I mean, I guess that's, I don't know. I mean, we can't necessarily kind of judge people in that way. You might hope that if they do find something that's really, really valuable, they might donate some money back to the charity. I would like to hope that they might think of that. On the other hand, I guess those people aren't really seeing it as any different to whether they pick that up in a kind of local Facebook or WhatsApp group, or if they picked it up on a car boot sale. Is it that much different? Maybe not. Maybe good on them for finding it. At least the charity has got some money out of it.
Yeah, I think these are really interesting questions, and this is my hope. The reason I've been doing this work, this wasn't actually the project I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was an oral history project where we could talk about people's memories and the kinds of experiences and encounters they've had. But I realized that before I could do that, I needed to actually figure out what the history was. What was I kind of building on by doing this oral history project, which is why I've been doing all this archival work. But these are interesting questions that you get here. So with those different sort of a kind of series, like a chain of different stores that one charity might have, where you have some in more of a more boutiquey ones in the kind of upmarket part of town. What you might get there is that items come in and they might put them at a higher price in one, and if they don't sell, then they might move them on to the next one and knock them down in price as they kind of go around. And what you get is, I think that within charity shops there is this kind of moral pressure to kind of find the right balance of charging enough that you're trying to make money for the charity, but that you're not going too far, that you're not being too money grabbing about it. There is a balance to strike, and of course, who decides that balance is the person who walks into the charity shop. So it's a very localized kind of moral economy that you've got going on there. So it's to do with those communities, but there is a whole variety of practices, and I think people make these decisions themselves. So it's when the person walks into the shop, what do they think? There's a variety. You get people who will think that they should be paying more, so they'll make a donation as well as paying the price they've asked. But you also get a lot of people haggling in charity shops. So people make their own decisions, and they can make very different decisions about what they think is right in these circumstances.
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic, isn't it? I think my stance is always that we need all the different types of charity shop. There's definitely a role for the more boutiquey, higher end charity shops, particularly if they're going to persuade more people who can afford to buy secondhand rather than buying new. But at the same time, of course, we still need them to be providing that vital role of providing low cost clothing and homewares for people who need them. So I think it's a constant balance. So let's have a look at some more questions. Here's an interesting one. Does the insistence of charity shops here in Sussex, that could be one of my parents, that donated goods must be of saleable quality, say more about how much subpar goods are offered or how picky the shops are? So that's something. Has the quality of second-hand items being resold, has that changed over the years? Do you think standards have gone up or down, or have they remained about the same?
Well, I mean, this is an argument that's been going on across the kind of charity shop world for more than half a century. It was a real kind of concern, particularly for Oxfam, having the kind of reputation of their Broad Street shop, which was quite high end. They said they wanted it to be, trying to remember what the phrase they used was, but they wanted it to be more auction house than jumble sale. That wasn't necessarily what the different local branches were doing. So you had this balance there. So I think you've always had the range, and there's always been that argument going on. But hearing some of the stories, because my wife works in a charity shop, hearing some of the stories of what she's been going through, and what items she's found in some of the donations, how soiled some of the things that get donated are. There is definitely there's not really a flaw in what gets donated. There's all kinds of things that people have to to handle and deal with in charity shops in the back room of the shop.
Yeah, I guess there is that idea that some people use them as a way to give back, and other people use them as a sort of way to cast off their rubbish without having to bother taking a trip to the recycling centre or the dump. There's also a question here about second-hand bookshops. So how many charity bookshops have closed, they're asking, due to unfair competition from shops to get rate relief? Oh no, sorry. How many second-hand bookshops have closed due to unfair competition from charity shops? So is that a tension that you're familiar with at all, that charity shops are given greater reliefs, tax reliefs and rate reliefs, so they're able to flourish maybe where other second-hand bookshops are not?
That's a good question. I'm trying to. So, in terms of the tax reliefs, that has changed. So, tax reliefs now are greater, but there were different tax reliefs that were around, say, in the sort of in the 1960s and 70s. But the scale and the nature of those tax reliefs, it is greater now. So that may have something to do with it. But sorry, I wasn't quite sure I followed the question. But in terms of bookshops. That was an interesting part of it, because bookshops keep coming up as something that you get within charities. So in Oxfam, I've read a lot of stuff from people who in the 1980s working for Oxfam were really pleased with what they thought they'd done of inventing the secondhand bookshop, or the charity secondhand bookshop. And this surprised me, because I'd been reading through their records and their archives, and I knew that there had been one in the same town, just 20 years earlier. They'd opened one, and then they were opening another one now and feeling they'd invented it. So selling books is a big part of it. But what I thought the question was going to be was about buying books online, about Amazon and these sorts of things, and whether that was crowding them out. But of course, charities themselves do sometimes do selling online through eBay, through other things, and actually that in itself is not so different from the mail order services that a lot of charities, whether it was Salvation Army or St Dunstan's or whoever, mail order selling was a big thing 100 years ago, and big for charity retailers, in perhaps a much bigger deal then through mail order than selling online is now. So maybe today's charity shops are behind the game from their Edwardian predecessors in that respect.
Wow, that's fascinating. I would never have guessed that. So we've got time for one final question. Let's see. Here's a nice simple one. I'll put it to both of you. What is the future of charity shop? Georgina, do you want to sum it up?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting one. So I had heard, and I do think that we're in a bit of a difficult situation at the moment with COVID, and with the fact that charities themselves are actually suffering a loss of income across a whole range of ways. So they're losing income left, right and centre, unfortunately, and have not had very little kind of government support to kind of do that. So before all of this happened, I was hearing about really exciting developments. For example, Oxfam have opened a kind of superstore on the outskirts of Oxfam. I believe it's on a kind of kind of out of town, a charity shop basically, which is a kind of new model. So they're kind of trying to go where the people are. So I guess if the high streets are just becoming charity shops, I mean, that's one of the arguments. I think we could just dispute that. But, if that is the case, then charity shops need to be like the businesses that they are, as they have been for over 100 years, and kind of go where the people are. So kind of having these different types of store. I don't know how far that's will be affected by the kind of current COVID crisis. But I do think that, moving online, selling things through, you can buy charity things for a charity on eBay, on Amazon. So I think they're going to have to adapt to that kind of world. There is a bit of a time lag, because we know that it's actually older shoppers that generally shop in charity shops, not exclusively, but more older shoppers would do. So they perhaps have a bit of a time lag, but they are going to have to adapt and are going to have to change. But we know that they can do that, because we know they've done that for over 100 years.
Yeah, and in terms of the the space. So you think of this this out of town Oxford sort of superstore charity shop. One of the things there, of course, is that it's bigger. It is more spacious, and if we are in a kind of socially distanced world, then this is going to be a big deal for charity shops who. Through their history, for fundraising shops in particular, the real challenge that they have constantly been facing is about finding enough space, finding premises, negotiating over what space they can use, and trying to fit it out and make a shop fit into the spaces they can find and get access to. And of course, what that looks like is so different now from it was a year ago in terms of having space for where do you have donations, where do you leave things if you need to quarantine them before you can go through them, how many people can you fit into a shop. Those sorts of questions around social distancing are a huge challenge for charity shops. And I think there's going to be a big question about what does the new normal look like? Do we have to rethink what kind of space we think a charity shop needs? That's going to be a big question.
Absolutely. That is the $1 million question for everything at the moment, isn't it? But of course, as you've explained to us so brilliantly, charity shops have evolved over centuries, and I'm sure they will continue evolving. Well, thank you so much again to Georgina and George for joining us tonight. So you can find out more about the project by visiting the website, and the link is in the chat now for everybody who's been watching. There are still more events taking place throughout the rest of the week as part of the Being Human Festival, and you can find all the details at beinghumanfestival.org. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and have a good evening.